aparato.
Para que Guatemala avance, tiene que haber justicia por las vidas que fueron tomadas y la tierra que fue robada.
A usted lo acusan de la comisión del delito de genocidio.
En Guatemala no hubo genocidio, en ningún régimen. En Guatemala no hubo genocidio.
No voy a descansar hasta verlos en la cárcel.
No es fácil ver a un asesino a los ojos y decirle, tú mataste a mi familia.
No ha habido ninguna prueba que evidencie mi participación.
Ordenando su ingreso directamente a prisión.
Que las juntas directivas al frente.
Y los pueblos indígenas van a defender lo que les queda de territorios con la propia vida.
El pueblo va a tomar el poder de Guatemala.
I'm from Clark's Green, Pennsylvania. It's in the northeastern part of the state. It's the northernmost coal valley. You know, the coal valleys run diagonally across Pennsylvania. It was a coal mining region, and I grew up in a town of 2,000 people.
And how do you end up going to New York City? What was the draw?
I ran away from home when I was 15. There was nothing for me in that town, and there were no jobs. It was really poverty-stricken by that time. And you know, we used to listen to Cousin Brucey on our transistor radios underneath the covers at night. If we stayed up till 2 or 3 in the morning, we could get the AM New York radio waves and we could listen to the stations. And New York was like Oz to me. I wanted to go there. And I wanted to be part of social movements. You know, I came of age in the 1960s, but I was really isolated from the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the women's movement. And I really wanted to know what that was. I wanted to immerse myself in it. I wanted to live it. And the only way to do that was to go to a city. So I went to New York City.
You went to the city, and how did you find yourself? You know, I've read your resume, followed you quite a bit. How did you, as segue, what was the aha moment to get into the film world?
Well, I'm from an Irish-American enclave in the coal mining region in Pennsylvania, and the currency and trade in my town was storytelling. So if you were a really good storyteller, you were the most popular person in town. Didn't matter your social standing or anything. And my father was a really great storyteller. So I like to think that my pursuit of telling documentary film stories is really carrying on the legacy from my culture, from my town. I just am transferring it into the nonfiction film realm.
I'm curious because you have to go from getting the talking heads to getting the action to convincing somebody to just expose themselves when otherwise they would not. How did you learn that skill set?
Well, documentary filmmaking is really like learning a language. It's learning an audiovisual language. And you get better and better at speaking that language the more that you do it. I was always really curious about people. That is my motivation. And my parents in my small town in Pennsylvania used to send me down to the neighbors, the new neighbors that had just moved into town, to find out everything about them. Where they worked, how many children they had, what their religion was. And I was very good at doing that. I loved doing it. I mean, they didn't have to push me to do it. I did it very naturally. And as a 5-year-old kid, people open up to you a lot more because you're not judging them, you're just really curious about them. And that was really my beginning in documentary film. I think the other thing is the films are made up of protagonists and antagonists. The film that I'm showing here, 500 Years, about the Rios Montt genocide trial in Guatemala, we got a great antagonist, which is the daughter of Rios Montt, who defends her father to the T and is a genocide denier. I think the key is to try to make people feel comfortable. And because people who do terrible things, they often feel like they're doing the right thing. and they feel like what they're doing is normal. We know from these International Humanitarian Law Dialogs about all the terrible things going on in the world and the perpetrators of these crimes. And many times they feel like they're protecting their people, that they're creating a better life for their people, and we don't agree with that. But it's important to include their voice, because unless we understand the thinking in the minds of the perpetrators, we're never going to have a peaceful world.
How did you segue into this sort of civil rights activist world and just not doing other biographical documentaries? Was that?
I think that was also because of my upbringing in the coal mining region, where the class differentiations were so sharp. There were the coal mine owners, and then there were the coal miners. There really wasn't a middle class in my town. And so a lot of the stories that we told were about the excesses of the rich and the cruelty of the rich. And the stories had a lot of humor in them, so we could laugh at the people who were oppressing us. And the stories were also about the heroes in the coal mines, the union leaders and the people who stood up against injustice. And I think for a child, this standing up against injustice is really, it's an innate human thing. And it was strengthened in me very, very early on. So it was natural for me as I grew up. The kinds of stories that I wanted to tell was about injustice and the search for justice and successfully reckoning with crimes, and the justice initiatives focused on punishing those crimes.
60 Minutes is very good at sort of that point, counterpoint, trying to, I don't want to say entrap, but you've got somebody who is the person who you really are focusing in on, the person who created this injustice, the perpetrator. How do you get them to talk? They know what you're doing. I mean, you'd like to think you're doing a documentary that they just want to tell their story, but how do you convince them to go on?
I spend a lot of time with them, and I make them know that their point of view is important. I think it is important because we're not telling a complete story unless we include their point of view. And I don't hide who I am or what I do. It's a little bit harder now that everybody can know everything about you because of the internet and all of the information that's up there that's public knowledge. But I still really try to do it. You know, I love all the characters in the films, I have to say. Even the perpetrators, I try to deeply understand what it is that they do and why they do it. And so I think I communicate that. I think that comes across, and I think that's why people talk to me.
How did you get caught up in Guatemala? This is the third one, right? This is the end of the. Is this the end of the? Is this a trilogy?
Well, that speaks to the next film we're going to do, which is about a super effective justice mechanism. That I can't really talk about the film, but our next film is going to be about an effective international justice mechanism. Okay. In Guatemala, I actually first went to Guatemala in 1982 to investigate the role that the United States, my country, played in overthrowing the democratically elected government of Jacobo Arbenz in 1954, the first CIA-sponsored coup, and the brutal military legacy that the United States left as a result of that coup. So that was my motivation for going there. But when I got there, I decided I wanted to tell a much more complex story. And that story was, why was there a civil war in Guatemala across the political spectrum? I wanted to talk to the army, I wanted to talk to the guerrillas, to civil society, to the church, many different parts of this incredibly complex puzzle. And as I like to say, Guatemala wrapped its arms around my soul and never let me go. And that's why I began this 35-year journey with Guatemala, which is 35 years, 3 films, but 1 story.
Yeah. How do you know when you have enough to do a film? It's sort of the person who's writing a nonfiction, they keep researching. At some point, the shoebox gets full and you decide, I'm going to go with this.
Some endings are constructed and some endings happen naturally. In the film that we're showing here, 500 Years, the third act was actually written by the Guatemalan people themselves. And when it was over, I knew that the film was finished. So the film is really about not only the first genocide trial in a national court against a genocidaire, But it's really also about the effect in civil society that trial had. And the effect in civil society was that it really activated people, not only to think about the past, but to think about where Guatemala was going. And so it unleashed these investigations into the very structure of the government, and the largest demonstrations in the history of Guatemala ever. And finally brought down a sitting president and a vice president and several ministers. So you know then when that happens that that's a very good end to the film. And there will be other films about Guatemala. There's a whole generation of Guatemalan filmmakers coming up who are poised to tell their own story and are telling their own story.
As you look back at your body of work, which has been recognized, awards, you name it, Pam Yates has got a lot of credentials here. Is there one where you'd like to say, go back and redo the film and say, I know a lot more now, and kind of do a redux or something like that? Is that?
Well, in many ways, after When the Mountains Tremble, Granito, How to Nail a Dictator, and 500 Years are a continuation of the story. It's not a going back, right? But it's actually looking back at the story we told then and telling it in the present with some new ideas and some new twists. Each of the films is stylistically different, so they're individual, and you can see each film and not have to have seen the other films. But we are looking back, and it's funny when you look back and you look back at a crime or the acceptance of a crime in the present and wonder, like, how could we have thought that, or how could we have acted that way? And those are expressed in the subsequent two films. And maybe you hit on something. Maybe that was the impetus, really, subconsciously, for me to go back and continue to tell stories about Guatemala. When the film is finished, it's finished. I think if you, rather than go back, you should tell another story that touches on some of the same themes as the original film.
Do you watch some of your old stuff?
Well, I watch When the Mountains Tremble and Granito a lot because I'm in presentations with them a lot. You know, we re-released them all together in a trilogy called the Resistance Saga, and that's been playing all over the country. And the other films, yes, I do watch them every now and then. Some of them were prescient, and some parts of them are cringeworthy. And also, I look back at my first film, which was about the violent white right in the United States. It's called Resurgence, and it's about the new Ku Klux Klan that was forming in the late 70s and in early 80s in the American South. And I see that I tried to put everything that I ever thought politically into this one film. I mean, it's just stuffed full of ideas. And from that film, I learned that just as it's important to put things into a story, it's also important to know what to take out of a story. But that film is chock full of ideas about race, about equality, about the North versus the South, and about the ultra-right in the United States.
So I'm going to interview Paco here in a few minutes. What's he going to say that you bring to the table that he appreciates the most?
The creativity in storytelling, I think, is what he would say.
We'll test that out. What would you say about him? What does he bring to the table?
He brings in he has a deeply humanitarian vein that he brings to every story that we tell. He's a great producer because when people tell him no, he finds it a personal challenge to get them to yes. And he does very often, not only in the fundraising realm, but in the access realm, which is the gold for a documentary filmmaker.
Yeah, fantastic. So what's the question I should be asking her that you normally get from somebody who may do this?
Oh yeah, were you ever afraid? Or were you ever threatened?
Okay.
And of course. I mean, I was afraid doing parts of these films. That's for sure. I was threatened many times. I actually was threatened in the Guatemalan press during the genocide trial against Reyes Montt. I was called an enemy of the state and that I shouldn't be allowed into the country. And I came out actually in an insert into the major daily in Guatemala, of course, along with Ambassador Stephen Rapp, the Attorney General Claudia Paz y Paz, leading intellectuals, the head of the Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala. So I felt like I was in good company. But in terms of fear, I think it's important to face the fear and try to do a fear jiu-jitsu. Try to channel the fear into the creative process or compartmentalize it so that it doesn't get in the way of your telling the story that needs to be told.
Female, male, documentarian, you were a product of the 80s. Did you have a ladder, a glass ceiling you had to break through?
I think I'm still breaking through the glass ceiling. Yeah, I could make a lot more films. I only make one film every 2, 3, 4 years. I'd like to be making a lot more films. I have a lot more films. I have a lot more stories to tell. Well, there are a lot of stories out there. And you know, I came of age in the 1980s during the expression of the human rights movement worldwide. So it's those stories that really inspire me. And I like to think that our films told with these stories and the people who are in this movement help grow the movement.
You're fantastic.